Welcome back to the ITSS Verona Member Series podcast. In this episode, we're speaking to Dr. R. Evan Ellis. Dr. Ellis is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, where his work focuses on the region's engagement with China, transnational organized crime, and populism. He previously served on the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff covering Latin America and international narcotics issues, and is the author of 5 books on China-Latin America relations, including Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean, published in 2018. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be with you today in the program.
Dr. Evan Ellis, could you please tell us what are the main forms of Chinese organized crimes that takes place in Latin America today?
Sure. The forms of crime are relatively broad and oftentimes interconnected, but I'll try to sketch out some of the activities that various different Cantonese and Fujian-based families are involved in. Number one is human trafficking, human smuggling, oftentimes sponsored by local communities in the United States or Latin America, but working through trafficking networks throughout Latin America. You have connected with that different extortion activities and what one would call protection and financing activities by those Chinese groups that operate within Latin American and Caribbean communities. And then in addition to that, you have things like the facilitation of precursor chemicals for synthetic drugs, mostly fentanyl, but also in the production of methamphetamines and other goods, which oftentimes go to the European market. And again, that's a mixture often of Cantonese, but principally Fujian-based families involved in that, usually working with local groups such as, for example, the Sinaloa cartel in the case of production of fentanyl precursors in Mexico. And then in addition, you have various roles in the acquisition and the whole value chain for gold and other illegal and informal mining operations. And that's in many different countries from Peru to the interior of Suriname and Guyana and elsewhere. And again, on the one hand, you often have Chinese groups that are involved in the acquisition of the gold and local purchasers who are often local nationals with Chinese connections. But then you also have Chinese shopkeepers and others involved in the bringing in of the mining supplies, including things like mercury that do, of course, tremendous damage to the environment. More broadly, you also have Chinese groups involved in the demand for different materials, exotic flora and fauna. And so you have everything from working to obtain jaguar teeth and butterflies and shark fins to more traditional things like illegal timber mining in the interiors, again, of Guyana and Suriname and in other places. And then on top of that, you have a whole series of activities involved in money laundering. This goes from small scale money laundering through casinos, particularly in the Caribbean, and sometimes also types of games. There's a national lottery called Play Hui, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago. But it also extends to broad money laundering in support of transnational cartels. This is both trade-based money laundering involving the acquisition of things in China, and most recently, what one sees more and more is the use of Chinese financial networks and Chinese mafia groups operating in the region through a triangular scheme, which we can explain that works with Chinese in the United States, Chinese in Latin America, and wealthy people in China who want to get their money out of China, collaborating together with Chinese institutions to launder money that way. That's oftentimes much, frankly, safer for them and with lower margins than traditional ways of repatriating money for groups like Sinaloa or Jalisco Nueva Generación. So it's a whole range of things, and different groups are involved in different activities. But that's at least a preliminary sketch of what's going on.
Thank you. That's really insightful. So for our next question, how do you distinguish between purely criminal Chinese networks in the region and activity that's connected to or tolerated by the Chinese state?
It's a great question, and it's hard to say that it's one or the other. My sense from following this over a number of years is that while the Chinese state is not behind the vast majority of criminal activities, it both tolerates and oftentimes it takes advantage of those activities for its own purpose. So, first of all, one notices that the Chinese are relatively slow in acting against the trade in synthetic drugs and precursor chemicals. With the United States, it took a lot of effort by the Department of State, National Narcotics and Law Enforcement, pressing China to finally get them in 2019 to control various categories of fentanyl production. And then, with respect to the Mexican government, the Chinese government even denied that it had knowledge of that, although subsequently it has reluctantly controlled various different groups. Now, there are hundreds of chemical companies in China, so it's arguably hard to control them all. But what you do see is that Chinese state that can control the information activities of 1.4 billion people. It's implausible to say that they can't do more for a few hundred chemical companies. But in addition to that, you find different people who are involved in the trade, often with ties as senior Chinese business people. And so that suggests that there is some level of Communist Party tolerance. And the other thing which is interesting, Chinese, what they call police stations, operate throughout Latin America. These are entities that appear to be set up with the complicity or backing of the Chinese People's National Police and perhaps other organizations like their intelligence services, but reach out to ethnic Chinese operating in the region, ostensibly to help them with consular services and other affairs, but in the end, using the connection to people back in China to extort those persons. And the reasons I mention this particularly because the connections with the Chinese state of that. I was recently in Chile, and for example, one of the many police stations that are found informally in the region, this particular one happened to be in Valparaiso, Chile. The place that the police station was operating out of, a Chinese restaurant in Valparaiso, that same restaurant in its owner had ties to the Fujian mafia. So it's anecdotal evidence suggesting that naturally the Chinese organized crime groups who basically operate in the underworld in the shadowy domain who want to be left alone, they understand that if they cooperate with the MSS, the security services, that they essentially get left alone. And meanwhile, that gives the MSS and other Chinese entities access to these informal networks that China has connecting into their populations throughout Latin America in ways that the formal Chinese state may not have. And so, again, you see tolerance. The Chinese are certainly not in any hurry to help the U.S. with a problem such as drugs that is undermining our society, and at the same time, evidence that the Chinese are taking advantage of certain networks selectively, although not necessarily guiding or openly promoting these networks as some sort of nefarious plot to undermine the United States.
Thanks. We're also wondering what role does Chinese organized crime play in the exploitation of Latin America's natural resources, such as, for example, illegal mining? You did touch on these, timber, fishing, etc.
That's a great question. So I would certainly say that, first of all, in terms of volume, it is the Chinese state-owned enterprises and formal companies that play the biggest role in the exploitation of those resources. Because if you look at places like Peru, where Chinese SOEs are the biggest players, or in Chile, where 75% of Chilean copper goes to China, or even in places like Brazil with its iron mines, throughout the region, many examples that China's principal economic role in that $565 billion of bilateral trade that you had with the region is essentially acquiring its natural resources, realizing the value added for itself, and then returning, basically high value added manufactured goods in leading sectors. It's something that dependency theorists would recognize, but they used to talk about in terms of, the United States in the West. However, having set that out, when you look at organized crime, you see in a number of different sectors, for example, in the gold sector. And this varies from a Chinese legal presence in the informal or small scale mining sector. So, for example, in Nicaragua, Chinese companies, many very, very shady, have activities, have concessions amounting to almost 6% of Nicaragua's entire national territory because of that very China-friendly government there. You have similar situations operations elsewhere. I was just in Bolivia. You see, Chinese mining activities there, and so there is a transition from the exploitation of small scale mining, where things like the use of mercury, etc., the providing of mining equipment is often poorly controlled by the state, to explicitly illegal mining, as I mentioned before, where you have again Chinese purchasers, Chinese facilitators of the actual laundering of that. So sometimes the gold that is obtained in Peru, because there are rules of origin controls in Peru by governments, sometimes more strict than others. That gold is oftentimes smuggled into Bolivian mines, where you can get essentially documents indicating a Bolivian source of origin for the right price. So basically, the involvement in the laundering of those gold proceeds. And then, of course, beyond that, as I mentioned before, Chinese companies are widespread in the illegal timber extraction industry. There are cases like Baishan Lin, for example, in Guyana, which was basically kicked out of the country a couple of years ago for that, a Chinese company. China Greenheart has widespread operations in Suriname. There are similar companies that operate in the interior of Guyana, in addition to Baishan Lin. I was just in Bolivia again, and you find a China involvement in timber activities there, in the essentially the jungle portions of the interior of Peru, just to name a few. And so, timber is certainly a big area. But then if you go to, we spoke briefly about IUU fishing. This is an area where there is a formal Chinese deepwater fleet, oftentimes connected with legitimate companies that fly the Chinese flag and that are registered in China. But the activities that take place on these boats, there are estimated 17,000 different boats or ships in the Chinese fleet, of which several hundred each year. The more deep water ships, also logistic ships that will offload and onload the catch, everything from squid to more exotic types of fish. They will operate up and down the coast, coming into the Galapagos, going down to the coast of Peru, following the current down the coast of Chile, through the Straits of Magellan, and then up the coast of Argentina, operating at the edges of their exclusive economic zone, and then putting in Uruguay, and then reversing those flows. But again, it's estimated that something like $2.3 billion in unreported fishing, or fishing that is over limits. This is an enormous cost to Latin American coastal fishing communities, not only because of the fish that are being taken out of their waters without adequate compensation, but also because the way in which the Chinese deepwater fleet operates with trawl nets and other things, essentially catch things that you're not supposed to catch, or catch fish who are too young, and thus cause the collapse of the entire fisheries industry, which sustain those groups. And so illegal fishing is certainly another area. And there are others we mentioned briefly, exotic animals, whether it's the harvesting of sharks just for the shark fins for soup, or the harvesting of jaguars every place from Bolivia to the interior of Suriname and in Brazil. But again, having an impact on the animal populations, and putting certain types of highly desired exotic animals at risk of extinction in these countries. And so there's a wide range of different activities that involve the ecosystems and the resources of Latin America in different ways.
Thank you for all those details. I definitely didn't know about all of those activities. Um, and for a final question, do you see Chinese organized crime as a growing strategic concern for the region, or will it remain secondary to state level engagement through investment and diplomacy?
It's a great question. I see, in the end of the day, that the Chinese state level activities, or state sponsored activities, including those of its state owned enterprises as its champions, will, in terms of economic volume and level of activities, continue to be the most important. But I also see Chinese organized crime continuing to expand as a problem as those other activities expand. First of all, because the presence of Chinese financial institutions in the region region, the presence of Chinese trade patterns, the connections between Chinese and local business people, those all facilitate illegal ties and they create mechanisms for those ties to take place. And so the more legitimate trade and the more legitimate institutional ties that we have, the more the other problems we'll have. If you look back, for example, of how the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco Nueva Generacion cartel in Mexico got involved with the Chinese importing precursor chemicals back through what used to be called the Millennial Organization. In large part, it came about as trade ties between Mexico and China were expanding, and business people made those connections that then translated into more nefarious things later. In addition to that, you see, I think, the possibility that the way in which Chinese organized crime is done really puts Latin American law enforcement in a difficult place because often there's a lack of technical connections. Who is this group that they're finding from Fujian? What's their ties back to China? Latin American law enforcement don't always have those ties to get that information, and the Chinese government is not always forthcoming with that. Same problem with access to Chinese banks, and even with the groups that operate in Latin America itself. There are typically very few Latin American law enforcement organizations that penetrate relatively closed Chinese communities, let alone have have the ability to speak in the dialects. This is not Mandarin. Oftentimes, this is Cantonese or Fujianese, which is even among Chinese a very difficult dialect for even those Mandarin speakers to recognize. And so, basically, with those difficulties, the problems that Latin American law enforcement faces now is that they are already oftentimes impaired by corruption. They are lack certain technical capabilities that they need. They're diverted to other areas. And in the middle of this, what you're getting is these new techniques that are complicated for them to deal with. I'll give you a quick example. In the case of a new money laundering scheme called flying money, which was exposed involving the Sinaloa cartel a couple of years ago, what essentially the groups were doing was that instead of the traditional practices for repatriating money by the Sinaloa cartel, which involved essentially taking the bulk cash that they earned in the United States and then channeling that through hundreds or thousands of different people through remittance flows, or through doing things like buying Walmart cards, which also involved a lot of risk of exposure and pretty high margins. What essentially they would do is deliver the money that they earned in the United States to Chinese mafia organizations in the United States. The persons who had money in China who were trying to get their money out of China, who wanted unregistered bulk cash in the United States because of their fear of China's authoritarian government, would essentially take ownership off of the record, off of the books of that bulk cash, and then would transfer an equivalent amount of yuan or RMB into the accounts in China of Latin American business people who would then import goods. So effectively laundering the money, involving off the books transactions and Chinese financial institutions. So very difficult to detect low margins. And so I illustrate this vignette because the more formal ties that we have, the more commercial ties that you have these types of activities which are very, very difficult for Latin American law enforcement to get at. And again, one of the most effective ways to fight organized crime in general is by going after the money. And if both Chinese and non-Chinese groups have ever greater networks to hide and launder their money, it's going to increasingly impair our ability to tackle some of these groups which put at risk governance in Latin American societies and create flows of things like drugs and refugees, which are directly of importance to the United States, particularly the current government.
Thank you so much. That's been really comprehensive. And thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure to be with you on the program.
Thank you. It's incredible answers you gave.
Thank you. My pleasure. It's good to have this conversation with you.